Hi again, everybody. We're gonna give this one more shot. I switched to took the Wi-Fi off and switched to um, 4G. So let's see if that. Yeah, actually, what that I was trying to do 4G and it. I'm sorry, I was trying to do data and it didn't work. So now I'm switching to 4G, which actually worked better before when we tested this. Um, Michael, if you can see me, I think you need to send a request because whenever I try to find you and invite you, it's still not coming up. Okay. There we go. Okay. This shot again. And it should be coming in. Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. You look sharper.
I'm not feeling sharp. I'm feeling quite blurry around the edges, actually.
Ooh, so am I. Well, let's give it a second try here. How about, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but let's try again now.
Should we carry on? You were talking about evidence. I'd be really intrigued to hear, because that surprises me, that evidence would be the book that would be the influence from Larry's output.
That's interesting. I mean, I think in a way, Pictures from Home might maybe is his masterpiece if you had to pick one. But I'm just thinking about sort of my experience as a photographer. And then the book is called Evidence, someone asked. And it's pictures that Sultan and Mendel pulled from archives, like, police, science, laboratories, and sort of reappropriated them so that they were in a new context. And I guess what amazed me was this idea that like images that were intended to be documentary or evidence literally of an experiment or something could then be recontextualized and could be essentially poetry. And I guess that really fascinates me as an idea. Like you take a genre of something and it just changes completely. So yeah, that interesting, and of course the sequence, the idea that you go on this sort of like visual stream of consciousness journey with them, and as you were talking about with his pictures of his parents, the way they change, the meaning of it changes as you get older, sort of as I've changed as an artist, sort of the sequence and the feeling of the sequence has changed because it's never pinned down with
Yeah,
words ever, and so yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. And do you think that ties into an extent from the studying that you were doing, coming from the kind of interest in narrative and structure, the idea of storytelling, so to speak, and seeing it constructed out of such disconnected quotes, if you like, or paragraphs to make this kind of extraordinary body of work?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Is that idea of like opening a book and turning the pages as if going on a journey, and that
Yeah,
that feeling of like carrying someone through this vision or this journey, um, without interfering too much with text is actually for me what was so magical about that experience.
yeah, absolutely. Maybe we should move on to talk about Zizix, because you've done a number of
Okay.
couple of books before we met, and we'll return to those subsequently. But we met in Los Angeles. We met in Los Angeles in 2014. We identified when Parifoto, in the old days of art fairs. Do you remember that? The days that won't be in the
Oh
future.
yes, I miss them.
Anyway, we met in Los Angeles
Maybe.
on Paramount set, and you sent me an email and showed me a box of C-type prints, I believe it was. And you were living in
Right.
LA at
I
the time.
remember. Right. I was out there I'd gotten a Guggenheim fellowship and was out there photographing. I remember showing you this box of prints that was sort of disorganized, and it wasn't a book dummy or sequenced. It was sort of a mess. But you responded very generously, and you were very interested in the work, and that was exciting to me.
Did I not say yes immediately?
Not as I recall.
No?
As I recall, you had sort of like tiptoed right to the edge of saying, "Let's do a book," and sort of
What a
not
fool.
taking
What a
the leap
fool.
for quite a few months, I think. But I could be misremembering.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I suppose
No, no.
that says something about, yes, yeah.
Well, it worked out. It worked out in the end.
Work out.
Yeah, yeah. Although it does make me curious about that process for you, about sort of like what for you is sort of triggers that decision, which is such a clear-cut decision you have to make between yes or no, which must be such a difficult decision to make sometimes. Sort of what does push you over the edge, or how does that process look for you is something I was curious to hear from you about.
I mean, it's obviously it's different every time because it's largely predicated on the work and my response to the work and how I think it might become a book. But it's also fundamentally about the relationship with the person, you know, with the author, and how they might respond to our process of making books, which, as you know from experience, is a quite particular one, you know. And a lot of people are not necessarily would not be comfortable with that. So I have to choose people based on that and projects based on that. But that's why I suppose it's very easy to kind of rewrite history and say, yeah, I jumped straight in and, you know, I thought it was so great. I did think it was great, but I don't recall being holding back in my commitment to it.
Well, no, if I were in your shoes too, I would not make a decision like that lightly, especially working with someone new. That would be a tough
That was
decision to make.
That
Yeah.
was perhaps it. And I think it was also the fact that you were right in the middle of things. You were your family were in Los Angeles at the time. You'd moved there. You were shooting, and you were in the process of, you know, trying to take the whole project forward. And the images you showed me certainly were intense and had a very clear idea. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that process, because the whole thing took you about 5 years going back and forth to Los Angeles, didn't it? It was really a slow burn, and how you would bring
Yeah.
the work back to home in Rochester and allow it to develop.
Yeah, right. So I teach in Rochester, New York, at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and so when I had summers or vacation time, I would fly to Los Angeles and photograph. Um, and it wasn't until I got the Guggenheim that my family was able to actually take a year off of teaching and move there. And for me, it was like I work slowly and intuitively. It's sort of this, for me, it has to be a bit messy at first, and I have to sort of follow the intuitions that I remember Larry, speaking of Larry, talking about attraction, like to sort of like trust what you're visually attracted to. And thinking about attraction is sometimes irrational. And so it's sort of trusting that feeling of being attracted to Los Angeles as this complete mess, like a complete beautiful disaster of a place that's both just sublimely beautiful in places and just disastrously ugly and painful in other ways. And so that interested me. How do you take these extremes and bring them within the same, frame of your camera, or within the same, you know, covers of a book? Like, because photographers, I think, we have a tendency to sort of have tunnel vision for our quote projects. And I was thinking, what if we take this gigantic mess of a perspective on a place, and what if we pick a place that's completely impossible to sort of simplify or describe, and what if we make something about that, embracing all of the contradictions and extremes? So that's sort of the spirit of it.
So in a sense, you deflected kind of the issue of making it about Los Angeles by creating an almost fictional space. So there's a place that had a name. Is that correct? There was previously a place called Zizix.
Right, a place in the desert that this guy who's sort of a self-proclaimed minister, named Curtis Howe Springer, just sort of squatted on the land and said it was Zizix hot springs and they had healing properties. And he was a bit of a quack. And this town didn't exist. But then eventually, years later, the legend continues, and Zizix shows up on the map, and it sort of, he willed it into existence. And that fascinated me. It's this crazy little place in the desert. And I just thought that was sort of this like beautiful metaphor for making for California and for America and for this project. So
So you
yeah.
built the project around it, but it is intrinsically about Los Angeles because it's all made within the parameters of the city limits, so to speak.
Well, mostly, but it does start in the desert outside Los Angeles, and then it sort of marches west towards it goes into the city and then continues going west until you reach the ocean, more or less.
So it's
But
picking up a little bit on the manifest destiny of moving through the west to the end of the land in a sense as well.
yes, yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also
Obviously,
thinking about this. No,
sorry,
go ahead.
obviously you're one of those photographers because of the fact you're shooting quite a broad array of subjects. You're not just making portraits. You're not just shooting landscape. You're moving through a territory and photographing what attracts to you. You must then spend most of your time on a project actually editing. And how does that work for you? How do you kind of work through? Is it through contacts and then prints, and are there stages?
Yeah, it's really I think of them as very separate processes, and in part because I'm using film too, that they're very separate. So I will often shoot for a long time, sometimes a month or more, and just amass film. And then I don't even want to look at it because it's discouraging to me often to look at it, at first. And then I sort of have periods where I just delve into my contact sheets, which I'll show you in a minute, where I cut them up and I just shuffle through them and resequence and re-edit. And they're very separate kind of parts of my brain in a way. Like shooting is very intuitive, and the editing is, I tend to think a lot more like analytically about narrative and structure.
And how would you choose images that become kind of linchpins in the structure of the book or the exhibition? Do you make a larger print and hold on to it, or what is it? Is it a case of kind of?
Yeah, I think the first step would be, I often have these little shelves. I'll show you. I don't have the shelves here, but like this is what I'll do is I'll take a contact sheet and I'll write the roll number on the back, and then I make these little shelves and I put it on a shelf in my studio or office. And if I don't get sick of looking at it for a while, that means I need to make a print and take it to the next step. And then if I like the print after weeks or ideally months, then it's worth keeping. But I often get sick of the pictures after a little bit, and that's a way that means I just put them away.
So it's a natural selection.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Yeah, time is like the best way to edit, I think, because I can't see clearly immediately. That and an editor or my wife, Andrea Parlato, who's a photographer, or a trusted friend. I need other eyes or time. Those are like the two ways I edit, basically.
And the process of putting that book together was a very kind of fluid one. I hope you'd agree. It was very relaxed and very straightforward in the sense we worked largely from a distance through PDFs, and effectively voted on you produced the core of the edit, and then I had a few suggestions, very few actually, because you were very concerted in the structure and the idea that you had. And I came in just with a few things around the edges to actually mostly to question your assuredness about certain of the decisions you were making, if that makes any sense, rather than to provide an alternative.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember you having a fairly light touch in a way with your editing. And I remember being a little bit nervous about it because I thought, wow, he's really trusting me to sort of do this. And you did have input. I remember you cut it, I think, a fair amount. I want to say, 20% maybe you helped me cut. But yeah, I felt really like trusted by you that it was this vision that for the sequence that was mostly there, and it was exciting to sort of feel like you were willing to trust that. But well, I do remember. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just think that actually it's interesting you talk in that way about it because it is a process of trust, and in fact I remember distinctly one Friday evening leaving the office in London. Lewis and I, the graphic designer who was working with us, left, and we agreed between the three of us that the book was done and we were going to deliver it the following week. And I was really pumped about it and went home, was talking about the fact that I'd finished this great book that week. And then on the Monday morning, I came in and you'd sent a PDF, a final PDF, which had one little change. And I remember it was taking one image out, I think. And it was something that just took it a little, well, quite a bit further forward, actually.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was kind of that remarkable just allowing it to settle and coming back to it and pushing it that one stage further.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember that. And I also remember, it's funny you should bring that up because that is classic me also to like say it's done and then change it at the last minute. Say I need one more day and I change it. But yeah, I think we cut a picture that made the book a little bit more mysterious. And I think that helped. It like revealed something that was better that we left unrevealed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
When we presented the book in London together, we did a conversation like this. It was a little bit more straightforward because we were together and there were a small number of people in the room. And one of those people was a friend of mine, a writer and curator, David Campanet. And he asked a question which floored both of us and which perhaps kind of goes to the nub of in a very David way, in the sense that it went to very much kind of the heart, perhaps, or doesn't go to the heart of your practice. When he asked you the question, all the pictures in the book are portrait. Why?
Yeah.
And you went, oh, I hadn't realized. But you did then respond that you thought, oh, probably because I was thinking about the book page, as I was working.
Yeah, exactly. It was funny when he asked that, I sort of panicked because I thought it's just one of those things I'd taken for granted and hadn't thought about, and I hadn't anticipated anyone asking. And it was just that feeling of I wanted it to be, I was thinking about a book when I was shooting, and then I didn't even want the viewer to be aware of frame changing or anything. I just wanted to have the viewer fall into this land that I was sort of making and not have that, just take that out of the question somehow. But also I think seeing vertically for me is a way of almost like removing context of a setting, which maybe we'll get into later, but for me that's interesting. It wasn't a documentary project really, right? So
true.
By removing the background or the setting kind of helped its spirit, I think.
Absolutely. So in that sense, it returns to the idea that it was a work of fiction in the sense.
Yeah, I think you could say that, although, some would disagree maybe, but.
Maybe we should move on to the next project we did, which is Home House Sketchbook. And I think you're going to show us some of your working materials and give us some sort of background to
Okay.
Because visually, if you want to move over, I can keep an introduction. Because visually, it's quite distinctive. It's quite distinct from the large format color. The book is anyway, large format color. And I think what it draws us to...
Sorry, 1 second.
To ask you really is how you go from making a book to then translating it to an exhibition. Because in this case in particular, it was quite distinct, wasn't it?
Right. I always struggle with that, with how to, because I tend to think in book form, how do I then put it on the wall in a way that works? And I struggle with that greatly. I feel like the best thing I could do is show this sort of process, which is my bizarre like organizing system, which is like, okay, so for example, here it says helicopters. So these are pictures of helicopters in LA, or there you go, horizontal. It's a very small collection of pictures there. Let's see. Maybe these are, so basically this is, so the editing process, this is a woman who was in the book who had the white fur coat.
Very cool.
We have a version of this in the book, and then this is one of those sort of prettier landscapes that I remember you encouraging me to cut some of the prettier landscapes and just let the book sort of be tougher, but I remember that word, tough. But I think you were right, Nan. But anyway, so the process sort of starts there, and then these things came into it for me, which is I found this stack of construction paper. We call it in the US. What do they call it in the UK?
Do you know, I don't know. We tried to buy some and we couldn't. We were trying to do some tests with it and we couldn't find it. And it's pre-dyed, but it's highly sensitive to light. It's,
Yeah,
you know.
totally. It's like, so this, I don't know what caused this, but probably light, something. So this part was in shadow. So I started making a book dummy with this paper that I found, and then I started collecting more of it once I realized it had this beautiful property. So for example, I had a contact sheet on this page, and then I left the book out on my table, and that would happen. And I sort of fell in love with that. A note from my daughter. This was the cover of the book. Again, it was the contact sheet was there.
Yeah.
I removed it. And so I just fell in love with this materiality of it, and I felt like making a book that had this very unfinished quality. So let me grab. So this is the actual book for those of you who haven't seen it, but it was meant to look like my sketchbook. And I made versions where it was sort of not handmade like this, and it really lost something. And when we printed it, and maybe Michael, you could speak to how you achieved this, but you guys made the book in such a way. I mean, I photographed the contact sheets on the paper in such a way that these drop shadows were real. Like I wanted it to feel very much like you're holding a sketchbook. And then you guys added this kind of varnish where it's probably tough to see, but it's only on the.
It's just a spot gloss varnish, but it's offline, so it's very heavy. I guess, Greg, we do need to kind of pay respect to the fact that there was an original form of this book, which you'd made with a great publisher and photographer, friend of both of us, Jason Fulford.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, 2008, Jason, who is a good friend of mine, and I made this, which was, we basically just made 35 of these on a color laser printer, and he spiral bound them in his studio in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and we just used white paper because it sounds like sort of a very book nerdy thing, but like when we added color to this and we printed this on a color laser printer, it was all glossy and it just didn't work. It looked kind of lousy. So we abandoned that and we made it white. But I did this with J&L Books, which is Jason's press. And then, but so few people saw it. You know, we only made 35 copies, and I wanted to achieve sort of what we did with the color. So what we did was sort of the next iteration of it, if you will.
But so maybe talk a little bit now about how you constructed what the project was about, because it was all relating to work that you made in Omaha, very specifically, and it was very much, there were certain themes that were very particular to the body of work.
Yeah, right. I just kind of skipped over that, but the book and the whole project sort of, let me just grab something else. So this is a framed piece I'm working on now for the wall, but it's basically I'm making these grids that are 30 spreads from the book, and the content, just because I didn't touch on the content at all, but was really sort of about American masculinity and the idea of the American heartland and my own sort of feelings of discomfort, if you will, with some of that. I started the project when George W. Bush was president and ended it when Trump was president. And so that sort of colored in a way a lot of how I was thinking about the American landscape and American men.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it is interesting, Greg, because it's extraordinary. You had such great success. Well, we had such great success with Sizzix, and yet you kind of almost tore up that rule book to make this next project where you allowed the images to be small and weren't concerned about the fact that there would be perhaps a danger of legibility or a problem of legibility at that scale. We did discuss those issues. But as a consequence, it looks like a project from a completely different photographer. And it's rare, I think, that photographers change the nature of their language or their style in such a fundamental way. I don't mean photographically, but I mean the means of presentation. I would point out, though, that the exhibition that you're showing is just big book pages, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll show you a little bit of what I'm working. It's tough with this glare, but I'm working on this grid, which is incomplete. But it's I'm working with Look Gallery in Berlin, and the plan is, if Paris Photo actually happens, is to do a solo booth with a grid of 30 spreads, and we're just each grid. I'm only doing 3 sets, I guess. Each set is 30, and each set will be different, where the background color changes, and the images change, and it will be new images that aren't in the book in some cases. And the full grid will be something, I don't know if you guys are able to see this or not, but that's the idea, is to make this.
That looks beautiful. Yeah, it looks
Thank
gorgeous. And you're sewing through the spines as well, aren't you?
Yeah, this is so that I've got my colorful threads here, and what I'm doing is so basically I make these spreads, and I then sew them onto, you can kind of see there, I'm sewing them onto this mat board. And these pieces are tipped in, they're hand cut and tipped in. And then I put them into the frame. So
yeah,
it's kind of, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's funny in a way. We're just sort of, oops, sorry, reproducing the book in a way. But I'm really excited about it. It's funny how I think it will work for the wall.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really intelligent translation. And there is that it's often a stumbling block for photographers who are really good at making books, their capacity to then think about, the wall space. And it's quite rare, people like Michael Schmidt, Paul Graham, Wolfgang Tillmans, there aren't many people who have the capacity to think in both spaces, so to speak. Let's talk about the third project we were going to touch on, which is a project which you made in Guadeloupe, which is an award you won, and which is a book you're publishing with Aperture in the fall,
right?
With Leslie Martin, and designed by the really wonderful Hans Gremmen in Netherlands from FW Books.
Right. And I don't know if people are able to see the images on this okay, but I can show a few more from that project.
We can see things clearly, Greg. It's good.
You can. Great. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll show a few other things. So here's just the first, I had to back up. So polar opposite sort of scale size here. This is, oh boy, it's tough to see, isn't it?
No, we can see it. It's good. It's good.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So this is a 30-40, and so this project is the result of a commission from the Hermes Foundation, and they work in collaboration with Aperture and SF MoMA. And the commission basically says that it invites an American photographer to propose a project in France and a French photographer to propose a project in the US. And I proposed going to the Caribbean, to Guadeloupe. And these are just proof sheets, by the way, that we just got in. So it's really in progress. But I guess I was fascinated by this idea of Guadeloupe, kind of like Los Angeles, as a place that has a potentially very sort of messy, complicated past, and had like extreme beauty in it, but a lot of difficulty too when I think about the sort of legacy of slavery and colonialism there, and sort of also the cultural, how complicated it is culturally in terms of it being both French, European, American, and Caribbean. And so, long story short, I proposed going there. And so I'm working with Aperture to make the book, and then the show will be at SF MoMA in, it's just been moved now, but it will be in February, and then it will be at the right, and then the Henri Cartier-Bresson Foundation in September.
And did you feel, particularly in Guadeloupe, similar concerns in relation to photographing some of the people in Zizix in Los Angeles? Just issues relating to representing people. Some of the people you're photographing don't necessarily have the position of power that you have. And, you know, there are quite a number of difficulties there, especially when you're going into a country, as you mentioned, with a significant colonial past, from which they're presumably still struggling to escape.
Yeah, as soon as I made the proposal, and then I was awarded it, because I think 5 or so people make a proposal, maybe 8, and I immediately thought, how am I going to do this, and how can I do this?
Yeah.
So I'm yeah, white man, American. It's largely, people largely speak only French there. There are exceptions, and my French is not great. So there were so many sort of barriers and so many things sort of weighing on my mind about like my own discomfort with sort of being an outsider on so many levels there. And I think it interfered in a way with making some of the pictures that I wanted to make. Because in Los Angeles, for example, I felt like more entitled to sort of make it my own in the way that I saw it. In Guadeloupe, I felt less comfortable doing that. But I think, you know, I think that nonetheless, there's the possibility to really connect with people and to do your best. And I think that ultimately I come down on the side that that it's important to try. It's important to try to connect, and that you can't always sort of succeed at representing another person the way that they would choose. But ultimately, that's not the artist's job, I feel. The artist's job is to sort of present what they see and what they feel. And that's hard sometimes. But I think you obviously have to be sensitive to it. But
yeah, and I suppose it's also what's also significant is the manner in which you represent these characters, these individuals, in your work, in a book, in an exhibition, the images you choose in your editing process, and the proximity with to which other subjects that you place those portraits. That's a part of your responsibility, ultimately.
I think so. And that's where editing becomes a very important step, in terms of, there are images that I took that I ultimately decided didn't feel right or didn't feel fair. But, you know, I do ultimately feel that the project in the end comes out of, I don't know, there was a lot of love I felt for the place, and my experience there. And I hope that comes through actually in the project.
Yeah,
I think it does.
It does. It clearly does. It clearly does. I'm fortunate to have seen a PDF of it, and it clearly does. So let's talk about the last project we were going to move on to, which is a book that we were doing for January 2021, and fortuitously, right. You had already decided some time ago, a few months ago, earlier this year, that in fact we would move it to January 2022.
Right.
And in a sense, it's autobiographical.
Right. I think maybe it is, yeah. So I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and I've been photographing there sort of, I guess, seriously, for lack of a better word, for 15 years or so, maybe closer to 20. And I've never published a lot of these pictures, but I've been photographing in Buffalo and Rochester, where I live now. And it's hard for me to talk about because it is home, and I love it and hate it as a place. Here's the horizontal. Look at that. We'll have to deal with that, Michael. I don't know.
It's out.
Maybe.
Greg, it's out.
I thought you were going to say that. Oh no, here's another one. Here's another one. This one is amazing. I was photographing this frozen waterfall, and I thought it was incredible. And I spent, 15 minutes photographing it. And then I looked behind me and I realized there was this dead snake on the snow just 10 feet behind me. I hadn't noticed. And it was like a great metaphor for, you go out to try to photograph something, and you set off with your mind. You think you're doing one thing, and the thing that surprises you is often better.
Yeah. I mean, as you commented when we first looked at this work together, some of this work together, it's a fundamentally different color palette. Again, it's quite a distinctive shift, certainly from Los Angeles, where it's so high key, and Guadeloupe, where, you know, similarly you have these very strong colors. It's quite lacking in Buffalo. It's quite lacking in your pictures of Buffalo.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I worried about that in a way, like after making Zizix, where there was sort of this really almost psychedelic color palette to then going to this. But you know, there's something I really love about this too, the subtlety of all of these grays and sorter blues and whites, dirty whites. Like I like printing the snow kind of dirty like this.
Yeah.
I have a friend who called me a dirty C printer. These are all C prints, which I love too, because I'm not a great C printer, and so they sort of it sort of makes the whites a little less clean, which is better.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have to hope that people are sort of willing to go along with me for the ride on this shift here to this color palette that's maybe a little less dramatic.
And what ambition do you have for the project? Because in this situation, we're working on a book which is not a catalog because of the kind of generosity of the people whose show it will be at in Transformer in Cleveland, Ohio. We're going to make our own project, which I guess will influence the show, and vice versa, the show will influence. So in this case, I suppose a little bit like the Guadeloupe, you're thinking about both things, the exhibition and the book at the same time. But what overall is your ambition for the project? And now I know it's a big question, because as I started out by suggesting, it is quite autobiographical, and it's been going, the work's been being made for 15 years. But what would you like it to achieve in your hands?
That's a good question, and it's sort of a hard one for me. I just want it to be really beautiful and dark, but also have these little glimmers of it will, you know, we talked a little bit, or someone asked a question about magical realism on the Instagram feed, and the Zizix book from Los Angeles, the sort of magical part of Los Angeles is much more obvious. Yeah. Basically through the light, the color, the flora, the fauna. I mean, it's just incredible. I want it to be there in Buffalo, but it's harder. It's a little bit harder because it's not as obvious. But that element of life is always there, and I want that to be there also, sort of amidst this sort of a blanket. There's going to be a lot of snow because I think the city is amazing looking in snow, but yeah. I want there to also be these sort of glimmers of something else that's magical. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but that's the feeling I want people to get.
Yeah, you are. No, I'm very excited about it, and unusually we have quite a long time to develop it, so you will continue shooting, I guess.
Yeah. I'm going out still at least once a week now, and I say Buffalo because that's the origin, but I'm shooting here too in Rochester, and sort of within the region of Western and Central New York, but most of the pictures are from Buffalo. And
so will it be another work of fiction, in the sense that you will be threading together these characters and these places, and even though they have a particular geographical location, you'll be writing your own story through these photographs?
Fiction feels more appropriate maybe for the Zizix work, maybe because just there are these hints of almost the sci-fi that come through in that project. And I don't think it will be so obvious in the Buffalo pictures. I think it will be more, realism or magical realism might feel more appropriate way to describe it. Yeah. But yeah, it will be somewhere in that gray area that I sort of love.
Yeah. I'm gonna jump now to a couple of questions that we've been sent through Instagram.
Okay.
This one is from JMSBF. Can you talk a little bit about the process of making portraits of strangers, and if there is any advice you could share about trying to negotiate more time with them or hanging around a bit longer?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I do get asked that a fair amount, and I often feel like I disappoint people with my answer because I don't always have a great answer, but because I think some of it has to do with stuff you can't control in terms of like how you approach strangers, or how you feel talking to strangers, or how they feel talking to you. And so much of that is hard. It's sort of, you are who you are, and sometimes it feels very natural, and sometimes it feels incredibly awkward. One thing I will say that could maybe be encouraging is that I tend to be kind of introverted. I'm not a very social person, and I can be socially awkward. And you just have to sort of convince yourself, to psych yourself up to have the courage to approach someone. And then the more you do it, the easier it gets. You will get rejected, and that is 100% fair. And you have to remember that that is totally understandable, like to not feel crushed, because who would want a stranger photographing them? I mean, when someone agrees, it's also important to remember they have given you an unbelievable gift, unbelievably generous gift, and they have done something remarkable by letting you do that. And so sort of showing, just being grateful, and sort of showing that, and then offering something in exchange. I always give people my contact information. It's amazingly rare how it is that people actually get in touch with me afterwards, but it feels like an important step to say, here's who I am. This is how you can reach me. You can follow up. And it feels like makes it a little bit more balanced, because you are taking something immense from them in a way. And so keeping that in the back of your mind, I think, is important too.
I'm not a photographer, but would it be, is it rational to suggest that the quality of the engagement of the portrait session, if you like, doesn't necessarily determine the value or weight of the image?
100%. I mean, it's amazing. I met people who I've gone back to for months, who were just amazing people, visually amazing. Their environment was amazing, and I just didn't get a picture I could use, and I don't know why. And then there are people who I didn't even connect with, and the picture says something that's not representative of the interaction at all, but it works, and that's what matters in the end, I think, for
Absolutely.
me.
It does, yeah. All right, so last one. If you could address use, this is from 3 Blackbirds. If you could address uses of repetition and visual echoing in the process of sequencing a photo book, I would be much obliged. We can perhaps talk about this a bit.
Okay, that's a great question. So someone like Paul Graham does that like a master, of course, I think. And it's hard, I think it's hard to do. And I think it's like, for me, it's just a very simple question of looking and thinking for a long time at, let's say you have 2 images or 2 versions of a person. I wish I had an example. And sometimes it becomes more compelling when you have 2, and sometimes it's much more compelling to not show that second view. And I try whenever possible to only use 1, because I think it's a bit traditional, but I often think that the second version sort of weakens the first, usually. So it has to somehow reveal something that wasn't there, or make you second guess, or question the veracity of the first image, or change the way you saw it, or I don't know. It's a really tough question. I think, but you don't want to overuse it, you know?
I think the way that you do it, it's not necessarily just using sequential photographs from a particular city, if you like, or particular situation or mise en scène. It's more about the fact that often in a book I've seen where you will use something, and maybe this is just indicative of the fact that it's intuitive, where you use something that's perhaps formal, a shape or a particular resonance in one image that's carried through into another image, maybe a couple of spreads later. And it's that kind of collage effect that is the beauty of bookmaking, in a sense, and of reading a book. And it kind of echoes, and that's why this question is so strong, because that's exactly what it does. You feel the echo of the prior image, and it informs you again of what you've seen before, and fleshes out the images a little in a different way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so in Zizix, we have this image of a bird, and I remember in the editing process, so there's this image in between this, and then there's this image. And for me, the bird and this person sort of echoed each other in a way, both sort of beautiful in a similar kind of way, but I didn't want to put them right next to each other. So in a sense, they were because then it felt too obvious of a comparison. So I wanted there to be some repetition or echo, but not make it too obvious. Or
Yeah,
if the repetition can make you go back and sort of reread the book, if you will, because it makes you question the storyteller's voice, then it's
absolutely.
working.
Absolutely. And so it is that collage effect, or as somebody's just said, a memory lag, which
Memory
is
lag, yeah.
great, a great phrase to use. Yes,
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it.
it
Yeah.
is a nice way of putting it. So, have we bored one another and everybody else sufficiently, you think?
Not everyone has left. It looks like some folks are still back. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I really want to apologize for technical snafu at the beginning.
We got
I
through it.
take I take full blame for that.
It seems to have ironed itself out anyway. It's really nice
Yeah.
to see you, Greg, and stay safe, everybody. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Michael, for doing this. I really appreciate it. And nice to see your face. So look forward to seeing you in person.
Take care. Bye bye.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.